This is a firm warning and a red line for the criminals who targeted part of Iran's fuel and energy infrastructure in the south of the country. As a result of this action, the fuel, energy, and gas infrastructure at the origin of the attack will be set on fire and reduced to ashes. At the first opportunity, we declare to the army the cowardly and aggressive force of the American criminals, and to the Zionist regime, savage and child killing, that you will be forced to throw your soldiers into the sea and lose all your dignity. The necks of your commanders and soldiers are under the boots of the fighters of Islam. In the strategic confusion you are facing, the reality of the battlefield is clear. Think about the extraordinary events. You came with a script for victory, but now you are searching in underground and secret war rooms for a way to ensure your own survival. The era of your arrogance is over. Your only salvation is to escape the blows of Iran's overwhelming operations. It is to leave the region or choose death, and victory comes only from God, the mighty, the wise.
Now we have breaking news about the developing situation in the Middle East. Taking a look here. This is a social media post courtesy of the Associated Press. It says the following: urgent. Israel claims that the Iranian intelligence minister Ismail Khatib has been killed. Here's what we know so far from the Associated Press. They say the following: the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz made the announcement this Wednesday, that is earlier today and actually just a few minutes ago. The assassination of Khatib comes after the deaths of senior Iranian security officials Ali Larijani and the head of the paramilitary Revolutionary Guard, the entire volunteer force Basiji. The Israeli Defense Minister Katz said that, quote, significant surprises are expected throughout the day on all fronts. The Treasury Department sanctioned Khatib in 2022 due to his involvement in cyber attacks against the United States and its allies. He listed his year of birth as either 1960 or 1961. He said that Khatib was born in the southern province of Iran and that Khatib, quote, runs several networks of cyber threat agents involved in cyber espionage and ransomware attacks. In support of Iran's political objectives, once again, according to the Treasury Department designated in a new round of sanctions, the Ministry of Intelligence of Iran, one of the main Iranian security services, is responsible for serious human rights violations. There is a lot to address. This Wednesday, continuing the conversation, we will now have the participation of Jonathan Saye. Currently, he is a research analyst for the Iran program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for joining. This breaking news was released just a few minutes ago. I would like you to explain to our viewers the impact of this particular assassination. And then we will talk about other high-ranking Iranian officials who have been killed in the last 24 hours. But let's start with this case, the assassination of the Iranian intelligence minister.
It is, without a doubt, a very significant development. We have to analyze this wave of assassinations in different phases. The initial steps were directed at the main command structure, especially the military personnel. That's what we've seen from the beginning of the war until now. And now, with the Minister of Intelligence, along with some other people whom we will talk about in more detail, we realize that Israel is mainly shifting its focus to internal repression, targeting actors who prevent street protests from happening. So they seem to be paving the way for the protest and opposition movement in Iran to have a more balanced playing field against the Islamic Republic. But of course, there is much more involved in many other components. It's easier said than done, but in fact, the Israeli Division of Labor focuses on this. While the United States eliminates naval and military assets, the Israelis are more focused on urban areas, targeted assassinations, and the repression apparatus.
You mentioned, and let's talk about those other high-ranking Iranian officials, one of them here on the screen, the Israel Defense Forces, Ali Larijani. Breaking news. Yesterday, he was from the Supreme National Security Council and a leader of the regime. He was eliminated. Jonathan, let's talk a little more about the impact of this particular death, and really, how does this change the scope of decision-making? Now, in terms of whoever is governing Iran,
are you right to highlight the ambiguity over who is governing the Islamic Republic? The short answer might be no one or a committee of a few people, but that in itself already shows that there isn't a single person in charge. I know we've talked about the Supreme Leader's son. It's debatable whether he's alive or even capable of ruling, whether he's injured or in a coma. But that being said, this is actually part of the agenda or strategy of the Islamic Republic. It was designed to function even in the event of decapitation. That is, there was a contingency plan. If you are a mid-level officer or a brigade commander like an ordinary soldier in daily operations, you know what your tasks are, whether there is a supreme leader or a national security council. You know you should regionalize the war, use drones and missiles to attack civilian infrastructure, Israel and LF bases. And once those stockpiles are depleted and those capabilities are removed after the Zeniawa attacks, then you turn your focus inward and open fire on the protesters. Because in the end, the Iranian people are the real existential threat. As for who Larijani was, he, interestingly, did a bit of both. So, he was, of course, one of the architects who orchestrated the massacre of Iranians in January. He was definitely a key player who contributed to the deaths of around 40,000 unarmed protesters. On the other hand, he was also, as you mentioned, the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. That means he was also a military officer in his own right. He also had close ties with Moscow. That's another way to look at the situation. Therefore, eliminating him not only destabilizes the command structure, but also demoralizes the regime's armed forces corps. Now they know there is no way out for them. So I think it's a clear sign that the wave of assassinations is not over yet. And Israel and the United States will continue to pursue political leaders of the regime from the present, past, and future.
To talk about who else might be next in line among these specific targets. Jonathan, we haven't received many live images coming from Iran, but we have one coming in right now. I want to show it quickly. This is courtesy of the Associated Press, and it's related to Ali Larijani. According to the AP, this is the funeral held for that high-ranking Iranian security official. What it looks like here is that thousands of Iranians are taking to the streets waving flags and again, specifically for the funeral. That brings me to the next point because I want to talk about Iranians in general. It seems to be a mixed broadcast here, possibly from the state news agency, but take a look at this. A lot of people out there in the streets right now. It was just a few months ago that we were talking about many of those protesters who were out there protesting against the Iranian regime, protesting against the way the country was being governed. They were being killed for protesting. But now we're also discussing this. We're getting these images of thousands of people at the funeral of one of the officials who was killed. So, what is the feeling there in Iran? What kind of division do we see among the civilians living there? Whose side are they on in the midst of this conflict? And actually, regarding all the developments that have happened since those initial attacks on February 28th.
I can't think of any other country with such a huge gap and division between the ruling entity and the people. The mentality on the ground talking to people is that Iran is occupied by foreign Islamic forces. That's the mentality, and it really shows how the average Iranian sees these parades, sees these demonstrations. Well, first of all, what you see being shown in the media affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is by no means clearly indicative of Iranian sentiment. Most of these people you see on screen now are part of the militia, Basij, basically a branch of the terrorist group designated as an FTO, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And having grown up in Tehran, I remember that during any major event, they would actually bus people in from other parts of the country. So, if, for example, a funeral is held in Tehran, the people you see, most of them, are actually not from that area. They are being transported because they know they don't have enough support and want to put on a show of strength. From a public relations perspective, it's important to keep this in mind. What you see doesn't reflect what's really happening here. But as for what the Iranians think, look, this is a situation that's far from ideal for anyone. Nobody wanted to see the conflict escalate to this point. But still, the Iranians see this as a war that was imposed on them by the regime. Because Tehran failed to negotiate in good faith, didn't make concessions, and regionalized the war, they attacked civilian infrastructure as their main target. In the end, the Iranians see it this way. For them, there is no other way out but to move forward. That doesn't mean the average Iranian wants regime change at any cost. Certainly, there are pillars that could alienate the Iranian public. We haven't reached that point yet, at least. War fatigue appears over time. Targeted operations. Since the Israelis are targeting local personnel, it's clear that this war will soon enter a new phase. Look at what's coming out of Jerusalem, signifying that they are being sent to the Iranian people, indicating that in the next chapter they might, chegando muito rapidamente.
That's why we're going to talk a little more about some of the images we've managed to obtain from Iran. Jonathan, what's the status of that blackout, the internet war, and the communication blockade we saw when these protests began?
It's interesting that you compare this internet blackout to the one in January, which is really remarkable. So now, since this war began on February 28th, we've seen the longest internet blackout against the Iranians. That said, I'm comparing the images coming out of the country now with the ones they took in January. Even though the January blackout lasted about a week, we really didn't get any information coming out of Iran. There were no videos being posted. I couldn't get in touch with anyone on the ground, but now it's a little different. We are getting information, videos, images from Iranians on the ground, corroborating some of the statements coming from CENTCOM and the IDF. That, in itself, already indicates to some extent that there may have been some kind of contingency plan to somehow facilitate some means of communication for Iranians with the outside world. That doesn't mean that everyone in Iran has access to the internet. There is certainly a blockade. There are many people I can't talk to, unfortunately, my loved ones, family, and friends. That being said, the flow of information is not really like it was in January, which, in my opinion, indicates that maybe there are more Starlinks working, maybe more people are using VPNs. But another interesting factor is that Israeli attacks and those by the Ekiyamas in Shewa also hit buildings responsible for censorship. So, they also degraded the Islamic Republic's repression capabilities on the digital side, just like with physical repression.
Let's go back to some of those high-ranking Iranian officials who were killed. Here's another social media post from the IDF. Again, this is breaking news that we brought you yesterday. So, the commander of the besieged unit was eliminated. The IDF targeted and eliminated Golan Reza Soleimani. That brings me to my next point here. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, we've seen many of these leaders being eliminated consistently and quickly. But still, new targets keep emerging. Every day we hear about a new high-ranking Iranian official being killed. How many people are involved in carrying out these military operations there in Iran? For us to have so many high-ranking officials, or so many people, I should say, who would be considered high-ranking Iranian officials?
It's fair to point out that frankly there are many of them and they replace each other quickly. So the regime in Tehran has never been a one-man show. Like Libya or how Gaddafi was built on parallel institutions. The former supreme leader, Senior Khamenei, made sure that decapitation would not be so effective against the Islamic Republic. So now, as you pointed out, there is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, then the Basiji, and there is still the intelligence apparatus, which by itself is quite significant. Then you have the regular armed forces, and in addition there is the political leadership, which is both in the civil and military spheres. So again, yes, you're right to point out that there is quite an extensive network of these guys. Another way to look at this, when it comes strictly to numbers, Iran has a population of 90 million. Estimates vary regarding the number of regime supporters. It ranges between 10% and 30% of the population, which still represents millions of people. Even after reducing that number by millions, many people could still take up the mantle of this regime. That's why it's important for us to highlight this. That said, looking at the way Israel and the US have eliminated some of these leaders, we still haven't really tried to remove the political leadership. So, in most of these cases, these individuals have some connection to the military or intelligence apparatus. Both are very legitimate targets, of course, but when we look at who's left, many people affiliated with the reformist camp are still around. There are some indications suggesting that Jerusalem or Washington might be considering using someone from within the system itself, recycling some of these people. It's debatable how effective that would be, or even if the Revolutionary Guard would allow it or not. But that being said, of the two people you just mentioned, we talked about Larijani, but the Basij guy, Gholam Reza Soleimani, what's really important about taking him out of the picture is that his job was strictly to be the enforcer of internal security. So it all comes down to him, his cadres, who would harmonize and really coordinate the crackdowns against the protesters. We're seeing this pattern emerge again. Jerusalem and Washington believe they've already done enough to weaken military capabilities. Now we see them shifting their focus to internal issues. So in the next week or two, I think we'll see some important developments.
I asked this next question to one of the experts and one of the journalists we had yesterday who is following this closely. I had seen some reports that there were possibly ongoing talks between maybe US officials and Iranian authorities for them to sit down, talk about what is happening here, and find a solution and how to move forward. Did you hear anything about this being a possibility? And also on the Iranian side, who would represent them? Any kind of negotiation, not just with the US, but possibly with other nations in the region, other Western countries, who would lead that effort?
We talked about how the political leadership is still intact, and that includes the foreign minister who has led many of these initiatives. That said, he doesn't have the authority to speak on behalf of the regime as a whole. He needs to receive instructions from someone, as you mentioned. So it all comes down to who is really orchestrating this. And part of the reason why I think Tehran is really reluctant to pursue diplomacy in a meaningful way. It's because they haven't even had a moment to sit down and discuss what they would like to observe. They want an end to the conflict. What concessions are they going to offer? They think they have some kind of ace up their sleeve. So they really haven't had the chance to come up with a strategy and assess what Washington might want, what Israel might want, or if the Europeans even have a say in this. That said, even in times of peace, they never negotiate in good faith under the Biden administration. Before the Women Life Freedom Movement of 2022, they were heading in one direction, but that didn't really lead anywhere in any meaningful way. So it doesn't matter if there was maximum pressure, maximum conciliation, war, or the Midnight Hammer operation, we haven't seen any change in behavior. We haven't seen Tehran change its stance. So the more isolated they feel, the more paranoid they become. And for the Islamic Republic, and this is the most important thing here, concession equals weakness. The weaker they become, the less likely they are to show qualquer sinal de compromisso. That. It sends the wrong message to their armed personnel, and it also demoralizes their population and support base, both inside Iran and regionally. So, at this moment, I don't see what they would be negotiating about. Sometimes they negotiate just for the sake of negotiating, just to project an image that the situation is calm. I doubt Washington will accept this offer, considering we've launched such an extensive offensive against their officials. Who knows who will be next? It really doesn't make sense now to seek diplomacy with a regime we're at war with and whose leaders we're eliminating.
I just want to point out that this is a live image coming from Beirut, Lebanon. We don't have a live broadcast coming from Tehran or any other city in Iran. But obviously here in Beirut, it's been busy in the last few days with Israel conducting operations. Jonathan, everything changes so quickly, so fast here given this whole situation. If you had to make a final remark for our viewers, especially as we look at the next 12 to 24 hours actually, what should we be watching out for?
We talked about how there's a new phase for them going after internal repression, but that also means going after the personnel, the armed apparatus of the Islamic Republic. Talking about all these different parallel institutions, we're still talking about tens of thousands, if not 100,000 or more of these members who remain. Let's even suppose a generous estimate of how many of them have been eliminated, maybe around 10,000, which isn't that significant. So that doesn't mean the main body is finished. I think what we're observing are any signs of defection, of them disobeying orders. We've heard information coming from Assad actually threatening these commanders, saying if you don't join the movement, we will eliminate you and your immediate group of personnel. So I think in the coming days, I'll be watching to see if Israel will focus more on hyper-local targeting of squads and units, or if they're going to switch to trying to get defections from these guys, from this personnel. I think any information from informants would be very critical. But again, I think this is the most sensitive phase of the war since February 28th.
Jonathan Saye, research analyst for the Iran program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. As always, we appreciate your time. Look.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.